Among the countless stories that have reached us from the ancient world, few possess such enduring power and influence on the modern consciousness as the legends of ancient Greece. A special place in this gallery of images is occupied by the city-state of Sparta, a name that invariably evokes visions of unparalleled valor and severe discipline. However, behind this powerful collective representation lies something far more complex and fascinating than simple historical reality, the so-called Spartan Mirage. But what exactly is this phenomenon that has become so deeply embedded in humanity's cultural memory? One of the most dramatic examples of this image's use is Joseph Goebbels' appeal in 1943. In the midst of World War II, as the German Sixth Army faced hopeless encirclement at Stalingrad, Goebbels, striving to inspire desperate resistance among the besieged, drew a striking parallel. He compared their plight to the heroic, yet doomed, stand of the 300 Spartans who bravely fought to the last man at the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BC. Thus, in his rhetoric, Stalingrad became a modern Thermopylae, and the encircled soldiers were urged to fight to the death, embodying the ideals of ancient warriors. This deep and centuries-old association between ancient Greece, particularly Sparta, and the formation of national armies and statehood was not limited to Germany. It extended far wider, encompassing all of Central Europe, where Spartan ideals often served as a powerful model for military valor, civic duty, and even social organization. The phenomenon of this historical influence is so significant that it is the subject of extensive scholarly works, notably the excellent book that explores this topic in detail, Down from Olympus, Archaeology and Philhellenism in Germany 1750 to 1970. It reveals how the ideas and images of ancient Greece, and especially Sparta, shaped the cultural and political landscape over centuries. But the echoes of Spartan influence did not remain solely on the pages of history or in European archives. They powerfully manifested in the modern world, reaching, for example, the United States. Here, Spartan imagery and famous sayings can be found everywhere, from stylized Greek helmets adorning various items to bumper stickers proudly displaying the legendary Spartan response to the Persian demand to surrender their weapons at Thermopylae. Moreover, these ideals have found their embodiment in popular culture through so-called Spartan races, grueling competitions where participants, inspired by the spirit of ancient warriors, test their physical endurance, strength, and mental fortitude in a series of extremely challenging trials designed to push individuals to their limits. It is the totality of these persistent associations, Sparta's link with unprecedented physical training, with military prowess and militarism, and crucially, with a certain idealized notion of masculinity, that forms the core of the Spartan Mirage. This mirage is fueled by the conviction that the Spartans were not merely skilled warriors but uniquely gifted or specially trained for these tasks, surpassing any other ancient peoples in this regard. This perception of Sparta as an unrivaled war machine and an image of perfect masculinity is what we are called to understand. The term, Spartan Mirage, itself first appeared in broad scholarly discourse with the publication of the eponymous book in 1933 by the distinguished French historian François Allier. His foundational work was dedicated to an ambitious goal, to reveal that the widespread and deeply ingrained popular notion of Sparta as an exclusively militaristic, wholly war-oriented society was, at its core, nothing more than an illusion. Thus, this concept invites us to view Sparta not through the prism of romanticized myths, but through rigorous historical analysis, which promises to uncover a completely different, at times unexpected, truth about the legendary city-state. In attempting to comprehend the phenomenon of classical Sparta, researchers invariably encounter a significant difficulty. This problem lies in the following. The earliest evidence concerning Sparta, or at least the settlements located in the territory that later became known as Sparta, refers us to the Greek Neolithic period. Subsequently, a Bronze Age settlement flourished at this site. However, it is only by the 8th century BC that it becomes possible to speak of the formation of a fully fledged political entity that we understand today as Sparta. Approximately by the 6th century BC, it had already attained undisputed political dominance, at least over vast lands of the Peloponnese. During the 5th century, particularly in 464 BC, a powerful earthquake struck Sparta, causing extensive destruction to most of the city. From this point, the polis began to experience significant political difficulties, which were greatly exacerbated by the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War. Despite all trials, Sparta ultimately emerged victorious from this large-scale conflict and subsequently re-established its hegemony. However, this supremacy was again lost when Spartan forces suffered a crushing defeat at the legendary Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC. The culmination of independent Spartan statehood was King Nabis, who ascended to the throne in 207 BC. He was to attempt to navigate an extremely intricate labyrinth of diplomatic relations, which included complex interactions with Macedon, numerous Greek city-states, and most importantly, a new, rapidly rising power in the region, the Roman Republic. Despite his efforts to preserve Spartan autonomy, the establishment of Spartan control over the strategically important city of Argos provoked a direct siege of Sparta by Roman forces. Consequently, their sphere of influence effectively shrank to the limits of the original settlement and its adjacent rural territories. Nabis' life ended in 192 BC at the hands of assassins, shortly after which Sparta became part of the Achaean League, a powerful military alliance of Greek cities. And although the Spartans themselves did not directly participate in the subsequent military clashes, the war that erupted between this league and mighty Rome marked Sparta's final loss of its independent status in 146 BC. Thus, the historical period under consideration spans nearly 700 years of Spartan history, and possibly approaches a millennium, depending on whether the proto-historical period is included. Furthermore, much of this extended chronology is exceptionally complex. However, the main problem researchers face is a palpable deficit of sources available for studying such a colossal time span. Nigel Kennell, recognized as one of the leading historians specializing in classical Sparta, summarizes these challenging aspects as follows. To provide general context, he notes in the preceding pages of his monograph the absence of a city, in the sense we usually understand a city-state. Instead, Sparta existed more as a collection of villages organized around an acropolis. Of all the numerous buildings, monuments, and locations in ancient Sparta, only 3 have been identified with any certainty: the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, located by the Eurotas River, the Temple of Athena, situated on the Acropolis, and the early Roman theater, directly beneath it. Outside the city territory itself, some other sanctuaries have been discovered during excavations. Recent superficial research, though significantly expanding our knowledge, has simultaneously initiated a number of unexpected but extremely important new questions. Overall, however, the region of Laconia remains strikingly underexplored archaeologically. For example, it is only since the 1990s that systematic archaeological investigations have been conducted at the site of one of Sparta's dependent communities, Geronthri, a project with the potential to significantly revise current understandings of Sparta's relationship with its subject communities. Considering literary sources is the next step. Constructing a complete history of Sparta is significantly complicated by 2 key circumstances. Firstly, there is a clear absence of an extensive body of text created by classical Spartan authors that could shed authentic light on the internal workings of Spartan institutions and the mindset of the Spartans themselves. Secondly, paradoxically, there is a significant amount of work written by non-Spartans that nevertheless purports to accomplish precisely this task. This phenomenon is widely known as the Spartan Mirage, a concept according to which the image of the historical city-state gradually transformed under the influence of philosophers, biographers, historians, and romantics. As a result, Sparta appeared as a radically unique state, unparalleled in Greece and often seemingly contradicting the fundamental laws of human behavior. This is where the main problem in evaluating Sparta lies. While indigenous Spartan sources do exist, they lack something comparable in scale and depth to, for example, Livy's History of Rome. A natural question arises: what do the few Spartan sources available to researchers actually look like? The most extensive body of texts available for study consists of fragments of 7th-century Spartan poetry. Notably, these poems touch upon themes of war and military activity, which seemingly confirms the deep roots of Sparta's reputation for martial prowess. And on the one hand, this is indeed true. However, the problem with the Spartan Mirage, and the entrenched stereotypes of Sparta as a harsh society almost entirely consumed by war is that military activity is by no means the only theme discussed in these ancient verses. Moreover, to some extent, when war is mentioned, it is not always the central or all-encompassing concern of the authors. These poetic works also touch upon aspects not usually associated with the image of militaristic Sparta. They describe luxurious life, exquisite fabrics, and other valuable goods, which, in essence, testifies to the existence of a rich and prosperous society. Approximately 2 centuries later, Herodotus, and then Thucydides, emerge on the horizon of historical inquiry, representing crucial sources of information. These prominent historians, despite their direct observations and presence in these places, were not Spartan. Such, in essence, is the nature of the primary data we possess. On the one hand, there are fragments of authentic poetry and a wealth of epigraphic evidence, etched on sculptures and architectural structures, especially temples. These artifacts indicate that the settlements forming Sparta, as well as the central area known as the Acropolis, where temples and other significant buildings stood, were centers of wealth and sophistication. This image sharply contrasts with the common perception of the Spartan way of life, which is associated with asceticism, wearing modest clothing, sleeping on bare ground or crude mats, consuming the famous black broth, a key component of which was blood, and constant, specialized training aimed exclusively at warfare. All these details have reached us from external, non-Spartan chronicles and narratives. A logical question arises: how should these two vastly dissimilar pictures be interpreted? The essence of the matter is not to deny the fact that Sparta was a militarized society, or that it waged wars. These aspects of its existence are indisputable. Rather, it is that the scale and intensity of these phenomena were significantly exaggerated by non-Spartan sources, especially Roman-era authors such as the famous Plutarch, who masterfully created and spread the legend of Sparta, particularly around their heroic resistance at the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BC. Indeed, Sparta possessed a well-deserved reputation as a warlike and valiant power, but the true reasons for this recognition do not always coincide with those attributed to it by the so-called Spartan Mirage. How did this picture actually look in practice? The foremost major source shedding light on Spartan military history is the 7th century BC poet Tertius, whose surviving works number approximately 250 lines. The preserved fragments of his poetry are mainly dedicated to the events of the Second Messenian War. However, although Tertius passionately urges the Spartans to fight valiantly, these texts contain nothing that could generate or confirm any unique reputation for Sparta as a militaristic society entirely focused on war. Most likely, Sparta's success in conquering the Peloponnese was primarily due to the fact that the total number of Spartan citizens, and consequently the number of troops they could field, significantly exceeded the forces of their opponents at the time, apparently reaching around 8,000 men. After the poetic creations of Tertius, our only reliable source for early Spartan history becomes Herodotus. However, already in his writings, there is a clear tendency to describe Sparta as an exclusively militaristic society, which, strangely enough, is not confirmed by earlier evidence. Such, in essence, is the general picture of Sparta as we see it in the period from approximately 750 BC to 480 BC. Sparta did indeed participate in military conflicts multiple times. Sometimes it was successful, but victories were not absolute and constant. At the same time, there is absolutely no mention of anything resembling reliable and systematic military training, characteristic of a society based on war. They largely seem very similar to other Greek city-states. It's just that Sparta had significantly more citizens. The formation of the Spartan Mirage originates from the heroic but tragic last stand of the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae in 480 BC, as well as the myths that almost instantly arose around this defeat. To understand the essence of the Spartan Mirage, it is crucial to recognize that 55 years later, specifically in 425 BC, Spartan forces suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of Athenian forces at the Battle of Sphacteria and, unprecedentedly, surrendered. Thucydides, who is our primary historical source for the Peloponnesian War, describes this event as follows. This event caused far greater astonishment among the Hellenes than any other event that occurred during the war. The general conviction was that the Spartans would under no circumstances lay down their arms, whether from unbearable hunger or any other form of compulsion. On the contrary, they would hold them until their last breath and die, fighting desperately. It was incredibly difficult to believe that those who capitulated were the same kind of men as those who fell in battle. Indeed, it later happened that an ally of Athens, wishing to humiliate one of the prisoners from the island, asked him if those who died were true Spartans. The answer was, spindles, by which he meant arrows, would be too expensive if they could distinguish brave men from cowards. This remark was intended to show that those who died were simply those who happened to be caught in the hail of stones and arrows. After the legendary Thermopylae, the myth of the Spartans as unparalleled warriors, disdainful of death and wholly dedicated to military pursuits, began to actively take root in ancient Greece. Since an integral part of this forged image was the belief that Spartans would never accept surrender, the crushing defeat and subsequent surrender in 425 BC, which was in absolute dissonance with what, according to the Thermopylae legend, Spartans were supposed to do, paradoxically pushed the Spartans themselves to fully embrace this created reputation. Commentators on the battle tirelessly emphasized the fact that it was the Spartans and their king Leonidas who steadfastly held their ground, bravely fought, and fell, defending the independence of all Hellas. And by the time these events were recorded in the chronicles of Herodotus, who is our primary source for the battle approximately 2 generations after those dramatic events, the myth of Thermopylae had already gained colossal power. In truth, at that time, there was not much evidence that could clearly distinguish Sparta as an exceptional militaristic society compared to other Hellenic polis. The renowned Spartan educational system, known as the agoge, for example, did indeed emphasize physical training when boys began their schooling at the age of 7. However, it also gave significance to the development of literacy, the study of poetry, and the art of dance, which clashes with the assertions of later classical antiquity authors about what Spartans supposedly did in their time. Instead of focusing exclusively on military training, the Spartans focused on shaping harmoniously developed citizens for their polis. This is why, for instance, in the early modern period, the Spartan system was considered a viable alternative to democratic governance, which, in turn, contributed to strengthening their military glory. Sparta did distinguish itself by developing certain aspects of its army that were quite unique, and this peculiarity should not be overlooked amidst other historical embellishments. The educational system, known as the agoge, over time acquired the stereotypical image of a harsh, ruthless, and strictly militarized training program. However, such an image was solidified only after Sparta's defeat, when the polis actively cultivated and relied on the legend of Thermopylae. Prior to this period, the agoge apparently did not fundamentally differ from other educational practices existing in various Greek city-states. The Spartans seem to have been unique among the Hellenes in that they actually developed and rigorously practiced drill for their troops, and actively rehearsed complex infantry maneuvers. Such systematic exercises, it seems, were not conducted by the armies of other city-states. Furthermore, the Spartans adopted a kind of standardized uniform, red cloaks and bronze shields, which ensured their visibility and recognition on the battlefield. These innovative approaches allowed the Spartans to prevail in military encounters. They emerged victorious from the Peloponnesian War 24 years after their defeat at Sphacteria, an event that so shocked the entire Greek world. The Spartans continued to win battles until they suffered a final defeat at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC, 30 years after the end of the Peloponnesian War. However, their victories in major battles are likely explained by 2 key reasons. Firstly, large pitched battles occurred relatively rarely, and Sparta, it seems, regularly lost in smaller skirmishes and engagements. Secondly, other Greek cities fielded militias that did not practice any infantry drills, at least not to the extent that the Spartans did. Nevertheless, these trainings did not transform the Spartans into professional soldiers in the modern sense. The Spartans managed their territory as landowners, representing a leisure class that certainly devoted time to military training, but by no means achieved the level of constant professional military activity attributed to them by the so-called Spartan Mirage. For approximately 50 years, in the period between the events at Sphacteria and the Battle of Leuctra, Sparta very actively utilized its formidable reputation as great warriors, ready to fight to the very last breath. Throughout this half-century, there was a very tangible and real perception of Spartan military superiority. However, the crushing defeat at Leuctra irrevocably shattered this impressive image, and Sparta was never able to restore it. In a sense, this circumstance hardly mattered, as Sparta's fleeting glory as an invincible military power became firmly entrenched in later non-Spartan sources. These sources shaped the perception of the city and its culture as they pleased. They constructed the image of a society entirely based on war, so that it would serve as a stark contrast to other communities in the region. It was after this authentic image was dispelled that the stereotype truly began to grow and gain strength. The agoge, for example, became an increasingly harsh and difficult ordeal, eventually transforming into the ruthless system we envision today. In fact, it became a kind of attractive tourist destination during the Roman Republic, when Sparta had already lost its independence. It clung to past glory to bolster its inflated reputation, making it a marvel of the classical world whose legend grew with each retelling, ultimately transforming into the popular conception of Sparta as a warrior society that has reached us today.